This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting across forbidden frequencies encrypted through the warp itself. In this broadcast, we unravel the saga of Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the Cyclopean Primarch, the mind that sought to master the warp, and paid the price for knowing too much. From the radiant spires of Prospero to the burning of his homeworld, his pact with the Architect of Fate, and his fiery return to real space. This is the story of knowledge, tragedy, and destiny entwined. Before we begin, steel your mind, brace your will, and strike the seal of subscription. Join the ranks of the Vox, for only those who stand together may withstand the madness of the 41st millennium. This is Dominissimo Voxlore, and this is the Law of the Crimson King. In the distant stars of Segmentum Obscurus, on the forgotten world of Prospero, a child fell from the heavens. His arrival was as much myth as fact. A burning comet lit the skies above the city of Tizca, seen by the Prosperine as a portent. From that fireball emerged a red-skinned infant, cradled within an unbreakable capsule not of this world. His body was colossal, far beyond human scale, and he bore a single great eye glowing with eerie power. The people of Tizca, already a society of powerful psykers, were awestruck, not afraid, but reverent. They believed the heavens had sent them a child of prophecy. Prospero was not like any other human colony. Founded by exiles and outcasts, its culture was steeped in the psychic arts. Its citizens openly practiced sorcery, guided by scholarly traditions rather than religious dogma or military might. And so, rather than cast the infant out, the Prosperine welcomed him. They named him Magnus, the Great One. Magnus was no ordinary child. He spoke not with his mouth, but directly into the minds of those around him. He walked within days of emerging from his capsule, and his mind pulsed with power that dwarfed even the most seasoned sorcerers of Tizca. From the moment of his arrival, it was clear. This being was something beyond human, beyond even psychic. He was a force of nature incarnate. Magnus's earliest years were spent among the scholars and warlocks of Tizca. His primary mentor, the wise and introspective Ahriman, taught him the basics of the Great Ocean, that is, the warp, as well as the ancient philosophy that governed Prosperine society. But Magnus quickly outgrew Ahriman's instruction. In weeks, he had absorbed years of arcane knowledge. In months, he could outmatch any psychic master on the planet. Tizca's greatest minds soon found themselves becoming his students. Unlike most powerful psykers, Magnus was not a victim of his gift. He controlled his abilities effortlessly, weaving illusions, manipulating matter, and communicating across continents with casual ease. He could heal the dying, calm tempests, and peer into the thoughts of strangers as though reading an open book. The Prosperine saw him not as a child, but as a saviour. He did not disappoint them. Magnus spent his youth unifying the scattered cults of Tizca, which until then had existed in uneasy peace. Each group had its own psychic discipline: precognition, elemental control, spiritual channeling, and more. Through dialogue, persuasion, and demonstration of superior knowledge, Magnus brought these rivals' traditions together under a single philosophy. He preached unity through enlightenment, not conquest. To wield the warp, he said, was not a crime or curse, it was a calling. His charisma was undeniable. Soon, the cults became schools. The schools became foundations of a planetary renaissance. Magnus helped rebuild Tizca's shattered archives, restored forgotten libraries, and reorganised the planet's philosophical tenets around a central theme. Knowledge was sacred, and ignorance was the only sin. He did not ban faith, but he discouraged blind superstition. What could be studied could be understood. What could be understood could be mastered. Prospero flourished. One of Magnus's earliest tests as a leader came not from politics, but from terror. On the outskirts of civilization, ancient warp-spawn creatures known as Cyclopean began appearing, ethereal parasites that hunted psykers, laying eggs in their minds and hollowing them from within. For centuries, they had been a menace that no psychic ward or army could fully defeat, but Magnus confronted them directly. He led an expedition to their lairs, striking them down with raw psychic fire. He used illusion to misdirect their swarms, telepathy to shield his allies, and brute force of will to rip the creatures apart mid-flight. The campaign was swift and final. For the first time in memory, the Cyclopean were utterly eradicated. Magnus was hailed not only as a scholar, but as a warrior king. The people of Prospero began to call him the Crimson Sun. In the wake of his victory, Magnus turned his gaze back to the warp, not to dominate it, but to comprehend it. While most psychers approached the immaterium with caution, using rituals and symbols to safeguard themselves, Magnus dove in headlong. He projected his consciousness into the great ocean, navigating the tides of chaos like a seasoned sailor on stormy seas. What others glimpsed in dreams, he saw in full clarity. This was the moment he changed. Magnus returned from the warp altered, not in body, but in vision. He had touched something vast and unknowable, and he came back with new convictions. He no longer viewed the warp as a mere tool or force. He saw it as a reflection of consciousness itself, a canvas for emotion and thought. It was beautiful, and it was terrible. He began to write, codifying his discoveries into texts, rituals, and diagrams. The resulting corpus became the core of a new library, the Great Pyramid of Tizca. Rising from the city's heart, the pyramid was both fortress and sanctuary. Within its crystalline vaults, Magnus stored tomes of prophecy, studies of psychic resonance, and maps of the immaterial realm. Access was limited to the most advanced students, and none could enter without submitting to rigorous mental trials. It was not secrecy Magnus valued, it was responsibility. The warp, he taught, could elevate the human soul or annihilate it. As Magnus reached adulthood, his power became so immense that even the planet itself seemed to respond to his will. Weather patterns stabilised around Tizca, earthquakes ceased. The city's architecture shifted subtly over time, as if guided by unseen forces. And Magnus himself became a symbol, more than man, less than God, but always watching, always learning. He was beloved, but he was also alone. Though surrounded by admirers, students and acolytes, none were his equal. His red skin, towering frame, and singular eye marked him as different. Most believed he was a divine being. Magnus did not dissuade them, but in private, he pondered his own origin. He had no memory of parents, no understanding of where he came from, only dreams. Dreams of a golden figure, cloaked in stars, watching him from afar. Magnus sensed that his destiny lay beyond Prospero, but for now, he was its king, and his reign was only beginning. The golden ships came to Prospero like silent heralds of destiny. Their arrival was not unexpected, not to Magnus. For years, perhaps since the moment of his awakening, he had felt a presence beyond the veil of stars, a mind unlike any other, and now that mind had reached out across the galaxy in both thought and steel. The Emperor of Mankind had come for his lost son. The reunion between Magnus and the Emperor was strange in its familiarity. Though they had never met in flesh, their psychic connection had long been alive. Magnus had seen glimpses of this radiant figure in dreams, in visions, in the quiet moments between breath and thought. And when the Emperor stepped onto the ash-red soil of Prospero, surrounded by custodians and clad in resplendent armour that shimmered like sunlit marble, Magnus was already waiting. No words were needed. Their first meeting was marked not by fanfare, but by understanding. The Prosperine scholars looked on in reverent silence. In the Emperor, they saw the source of Magnus's gifts, the explanation for all his brilliance. And in Magnus, the Emperor saw a reflection of his grand ambition, a being of immeasurable psychic potential, raised among those who nurtured it rather than feared it. But the moment of unity quickly gave way to duty. The Great Crusade was in full swing, and there was no time for sentiment. The Emperor had come not just to reclaim his son, but to offer him command. As one of the 20 Primarchs, Magnus had been intended to lead a legion of genetically engineered warriors, his gene sons, created from his DNA long before he had vanished into the warp. The 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons. When Magnus first saw them, he was struck not by pride, but by sorrow. The warriors who knelt before him in crimson and gold were broken, brilliant, disciplined, but cursed. The Thousand Sons had been plagued by a genetic instability from their inception. It began subtly, tremors, headaches, and occasional lapse in memory. But in time, the affliction escalated. Marines would experience wild surges of psychic power, followed by horrific mutation. Bones twisting, flesh unravelling, minds fracturing. It became known as the Flesh Change. Entire companies had been lost to it. The afflicted became monsters, grotesque, howling creatures no longer recognisable as Astartes. In battle, they were sometimes deployed as suicide shock troops, leashed in chains, their minds too far gone to distinguish friend from foe. For many within the Imperium, the Thousand Sons were a failed experiment. kept alive only by the hope that one day their Primarch might return to save them. Now, that hope stood before them. Magnus wasted no time. Taking command of the Legion, he made their plight his personal crusade. He abandoned the comforts of Prospero, sequestering himself within the Legion's databanks, gene laboratories, and arcane archives. He interrogated every aspect of their creation, every scrap of lore on gene seed stability, psychic mutation, and the intricate machinery of the human soul. Yet science alone would not suffice. Magnus turned to the only thing that had never failed him: his mind. With the warp as his medium, he reached inward and outward, seeking solutions not just in data, but in metaphysical truth. He meditated beneath a stasis veil for days without movement. He projected his consciousness into the immaterium to trace the root of the corruption. Some say he even called upon powers he did not yet fully understand, whispering to shadows in the veil to barter for knowledge. And then, he returned. The ritual he enacted has never been fully recorded, not by the Thousand Sons, not by any Imperial chronicle. What is known is that Magnus gathered the afflicted, those on the brink of the flesh change, and, in the heart of the Legion's flagship, channeled a wave of sorcerous energy that halted their mutations in their tracks. The flesh change ceased. The Thousand Sons were saved, or so it seemed. But power always demands a price. When the spell ended, Magnus emerged changed. His already inhuman features had grown more alien. His right eye was gone, not wounded, not gouged, simply absent. In its place was smooth skin, unmarred, as if the eye had never existed at all. He said nothing of it, and no one asked, but in the silence, many of his sons understood. Magnus had sacrificed more than strength. He had given part of himself to spare them. With their Primarch's arrival and the flesh change halted, the Thousand Sons experienced a renaissance. Their numbers grew, recruitment expanded. Aspirants from across the Imperium, many with latent psychic gifts, were brought into the fold. No longer seen as a liability, the 15th Legion began to operate in the open, bringing not just warfare, but knowledge to the worlds they encountered. Magnus encouraged a culture of learning. Each warrior was a scholar. Combat doctrines were studied as philosophy. Strategy was debated like theology. The Legion's librarians were divided into psychic disciplines: Corvidae, Pyre, Athenians, Raptora, each focusing on a different manifestation of warp power. Discipline, control, clarity, these were the values Magnus instilled. And in turn, his sons revered him. To them, he was not merely a commander. He was the Red Cyclops, the Crimson King, their saviour, their mentor, their living god. But to the Imperium, the Thousand Sons remained an enigma. They followed orders, achieved victories, and conquered worlds, but always through unorthodox means. Their use of psychic power, though restrained, made other legions uneasy. Whispers spread of fire conjured from nothing, of battles won before they began, of warriors who could speak into the minds of entire populations. Some called it brilliance, others called it sorcery. Magnus did not care. He had fulfilled his promise to his sons. He had brought them back from the brink of extinction and forged them into something greater. Whatever the Imperium thought of him, whatever his brothers whispered behind closed doors, he had earned the loyalty of his legion, and that, for now, was enough. For Magnus the Red, the war for understanding had only just begun. With the flesh change contained and the Thousand Sons renewed, Magnus the Red strode boldly into the galaxy of war. The Great Crusade had entered its middle years, and countless worlds remained unclaimed. For the first time, the Crimson King and his legion took their place among the Emperor's Reclaimer legions, spreading not only compliance, but knowledge. The Thousand Sons did not conquer like other legions. Where the space walls stormed with blades and bolters, the 15th Legion moved with precision, calculation, and, most controversially, psychic might. Worlds did not always burn beneath their heel. Some were pacified by dreams, others were simply shown the inevitable truth and knelt without resistance. At the heart of this transformation was Magnus's doctrine, knowledge as strength. The Thousand Sons were not just warriors, they were scholars, archivists, and architects of civilization. On newly compliant worlds, they preserved libraries and encouraged the rebuilding of educational institutions. When a population submitted, it often emerged from the process more advanced than before. But this intellectual advance came with something deeper, the subtle touch of the warp. Magnus taught that the psychic potential within humanity was not a flaw to be feared, but a power to be embraced. Cautiously, yes, but not suppressed. Under his guidance, the Thousand Sons refined their own psychic abilities into disciplined arts. Each librarian specialised in a distinct order, or cult, focused on different psychic applications. The Corvidae divined futures, the Raptora shaped kinetic energy, the Pyri manipulated flame. These powers were studied, codified and regulated, ritualised in battle, meditated upon in peace. The result was breathtaking. With surgical psychic strikes, enemy command structures were dismantled before battles began. Illusions and mental manipulation turned foes against one another. Some wars were won without a single bolt shell fired. The 15th Legion became a force of surgical precision, operating beyond the comprehension of more traditional legions. Yet not all looked upon these victories with admiration. Magnus's brothers were divided in opinion. To some, the Thousand Sons' psychic mastery was revolutionary. To others, it was a betrayal of human purity. Leman Russ of the Space Walls in particular saw their methods as dishonourable, an affront to the warrior code he held sacred. Mortarion of the Death Guard, raised among the oppressed victims of psychers, viewed Magnus's methods with open disgust. But the most telling reaction came not in words, but in silence. Many Primarchs, Rogel Dawn, Ferrus Manus, even Rabuti Gilliman, chose to observe from afar. They did not attack Magnus, nor did they embrace him. His legion remained an enigma, operating with imperial parameters but ever skirting the edge of what others considered acceptable. A notable flashpoint came on the world of Archreach Secundus. There, an ancient Xenos library, built upon psychic principles unknown to the Imperium, was discovered. Magnus wished to preserve it. Leman Russ, who had arrived at the system days later, demanded its destruction. The confrontation between the two Primarchs teetered on the edge of bloodshed. Only the timely arrival of Lorgar, who mediated the dispute, kept them from coming to blows. But the divide grew wider. For Magnus, the friction only validated his belief that the Imperium feared what it did not understand. He viewed the warp not as a tool of destruction, but of potential. Untamed, yes, but navigable with discipline and intellect. To suppress its use entirely, he believed, was to hobble the Imperium's evolution. To the Crimson King, humanity's destiny was inexorably linked to the warp. He did not see the Immaterium as inherently evil, but as a mirror, reflecting thought, desire, and emotion. Harnessed properly, it could be the next step in mankind's ascent. So he pressed forward. While others raised worlds and built fortresses, the Thousand Sons established archives and sanctums. They left behind vaults of translated texts, warp suppression obelisks, and guidance for those with latent psychic potential. And always, Magnus watched, guiding, correcting, and expanding. Still, troubling patterns emerged. Though the flesh change had been halted, isolated incidents began to reappear. Subtle, hushed, but unmistakable. Some initiates would lose control during meditative rites. Others began to display mutations too reminiscent of the past. Each time, Magnus acted swiftly, removing the afflicted, studying the case, and reaffirming the discipline of the cults. But the rumours spread. Among other legions, whispers returned, of witchcraft, of curses, of the Emperor's edict ignored in spirit, if not in the letter. Magnus defended his sons with pride. He insisted the warp was being mastered, not worshipped. That his legion's strict doctrines made them paragons of restraint. But restraint, in the eyes of the suspicious, looked too much like danger. The Emperor heard these murmurings. They formed part of a growing concern within the Imperium, not just about Magnus, but about psychers at large. Worlds encountered during the Crusade bore scars of unsupervised psychic outbreaks. Isolated incidents of corruption and possession raised alarm. And though the Thousand Sons had not been implicated in any act of outright heresy, their methods increasingly stood out as an uncomfortable exception. None of this slowed Magnus's momentum. He continued to lead his legion with fiery clarity, pushing into new systems, deciphering ancient languages, and recovering long-lost fragments of humanity's forgotten age. On worlds scarred by the Old Night, he uncovered signs of lost knowledge, pre-imperial archives, shattered machines, even evidence of human psychers who had not descended into madness. These discoveries only bolstered his theory. that humanity's future lay in reclaiming its psychic heritage, not denying it. But not even Magnus, with all his foresight and intellect, could stop what was coming. The Imperium, sensing the growing divergence between the Thousand Sons and the rest of its war machine, began to consider decisive action. Magnus did not know it yet, but the questions being asked in the Halls of Terror would soon lead to a judgment. One that would test the Crimson King's loyalty, not just to his legion, but to the very ideals he believed defined humanity. For now though, Magnus stood triumphant. His legion soared across the stars, spreading light where others brought fire. In their minds and in their records, they believed themselves to be the Emperor's most enlightened sons. But in the minds of many others, they had wandered too far from the path. And somewhere in the void, the warp watched and waited. The summons came like thunder from Terra. Across the stars, the Emperor's voice was carried not in words but in decree. A convocation was to be held on the world of Nikaea. All legions, all Primarchs, and the Imperium's greatest scholars, generals and mystics were to send their most learned representatives. The topic was one that simmered beneath the surface of every war council and astropathic relay: Psychers. And more specifically, the Librarius, the codified program that allowed Space Marine legions to wield psychic power as a sanctioned battlefield discipline. At the centre of this storm stood Magnus the Red. To some, he was the symbol of what Psychers could become: refined, rational, elevated. To others, he was the harbinger of doom, a sorcerer who walked too close to the edge of the abyss. On Nikaea, that debate would end. The world itself had been chosen carefully. Nikaea was serene, almost unnaturally so. Its skies crystalline, its air cool and dry. A place seemingly unspored by war or the warp. It was the kind of place where judgment could be passed without bloodshed. At least that was the hope. The convocation was colossal. Hundreds of Imperial officials, custodians, inquisitors, iterators, and scholars filled the amphitheatres, many of them wary, all of them alert. Each Primarch who could attend arrived flanked by his most trusted warriors and advisors. Rubric Guilliman brought a retinue of bureaucrats and philosophers. Mortarion, stoic and grim, stood beside warrior mystics of his own making. Leman Russ arrived like a blade, silent, sharp, ready to cut through rhetoric. And then came Magnus. Clad in flowing crimson robes over ornate armour of gold and obsidian, he towered above even his brothers. His single eye, glowing with restrained power, swept across the gathered assembly. He came not with soldiers but with librarians and savants. Where others brought arguments, Magnus brought evidence. Where others came to accuse, he came to defend. The council began not with shouting, but with testimony. One after another, witnesses stood to speak of Psychers, both their promise and their peril. Military commanders recounted battles where Psychers had turned the tide, as well as worlds lost to psychic implosion. Imperial priests warned of demonic possession, of reality torn asunder by those who tampered with unseen forces. Astropaths described the agony of warp storms made worse by untrained minds. Then came the Primarchs. Mortarion was among the first to speak. His voice, though low, carried weight. He spoke of his homeworld, Barbarous, where Psyker overlords had enslaved the population. He described their cruelty, their madness, and how the warp fed on their excess. To Mortarion, psychic power was not a tool. It was a disease, one that demanded eradication. Leman Russ followed, blunt as ever. To him, sorcery was sorcery, no matter how it was dressed up. He recounted his encounters with demons and warp things during the Crusade, describing them not as monsters, but as the natural outcome of unchecked psychic indulgence. To trust in such power, he said, was to trust in wildfire not to burn. Others spoke more cautiously. Rogel Dawn, pragmatic and austere, voiced concern about standardisation. Could every legion control its psychers the way Magnus claimed to? Could every world safely train those with the gift? Even Guilliman, ever the statesman, questioned whether humanity was mature enough to wield such a volatile force. The risks, he suggested, might outweigh the benefits. Then it was Magnus's turn. He rose alone. Where others had spoken with certainty or scorn, Magnus began with principle. He did not deny the danger of psychic power. He acknowledged the disasters, the deaths, the corruption. But he posed a question few others had dared to ask aloud. Were these tragedies the result of the warp itself, or humanity's refusal to understand it? He spoke not as a warlord, but as a teacher. Magnus described the Librarius not as a magical cult, but as a disciplined institution, one that tested, refined, and safeguarded psychic talent. He outlined the rigorous training, the codified structure, the cultural emphasis on responsibility and self-control. He compared it to a blade. Dangerous, yes, but far more so when left unsheathed and wild. He offered vision. He spoke of a future in which cycles were no longer feared or hidden, but studied and elevated. A future in which humanity, instead of groping blindly through the dark, could master the warp and travel its tides with purpose. Knowledge, he said, was not the enemy, ignorance was. His voice was passionate, but not pleading. His argument was compelling, but not defiant. And when he finished, there was silence. The final word, as always, belonged to the Emperor. He had not spoken until that moment, silent on his throne-like dais, surrounded by his golden custodians. But now he stood, and when he did, even the Primarchs held their breath. The Emperor's decree was swift and absolute. The Librarius was to be disbanded. No longer would Space Marine legions train psychers for war. No longer would sanctioned sorcery be tolerated. Only in the necessary psychic functions, astropathy, navigation, sanctioned communication, would continue. The line between sanctioned and unsanctioned was now clear. The use of psychic powers by the Astartes was forbidden. The shock rippled through the assembly. Magnus said nothing at first. He lowered his head, slowly, and gave the Emperor a solemn nod. No protest, no outburst, no visible fury. He returned to his seat, composed, his expression unreadable. But those closest to him saw it, not rage, but hurt, deep, cutting sorrow. His entire philosophy, his identity, had just been outlawed. Magnus left Nicaea with his legion under shadow. The 1,000 sons returned to Prospero, their future uncertain. They had not been condemned, not openly, but their way of life had been ruled a threat. For Magnus, it was more than a judgment. It was a rejection, not of sorcery, but of everything he had built, everything he believed. He had obeyed, he had explained, and still it had not been enough. The Council of Nikaea was intended to safeguard the Imperium from chaos. But for Magnus the Red, it marked the first true fracture between father and son. And in the silence that followed, the warp whispered. It began with a vision. Far across the galaxy, Magnus the Red sat in silent meditation within the crystalline spires of Prospero, the stars humming beyond his windows. Around him, his sons studied, scribed, and channeled. Their psychic auras like distant candle flames compared to the inferno of their Primarch's mind. And in that inferno, something stirred. Magnus was no idle dreamer. His mind ranged endlessly across the skein of the warp, touching the undercurrents of fate and intention, feeling the tremors of distant decisions. This time, what he felt was not a ripple, but a tidal wave of betrayal. It came unbidden, a blazing vision, seared into his mind with absolute clarity. Horus Lupercal, the favoured son, had turned against the Emperor. The War Master was preparing to unleash a civil war that would engulf the Imperium. Entire legions would burn. Terror itself would be threatened. The future, once filled with golden purpose, now twisted into horror. Magnus reeled, but he did not hesitate. The Emperor had to be warned. What followed was not a decision made lightly. Bound by the Edict of Nicaea, Magnus knew he risked everything by using the warp in defiance of the Emperor's ruling. But the stakes, he believed, demanded action. There was no petty ritual. This was a psychic cry of warning that would cross the stars instantly. One no astropath could deliver. He would speak directly to his father, mind to mind. And so the ritual began. Within the Great Pyramid of Tizca, Magnus assembled a convergence of his most powerful psychers. The air shimmered as power thickened, vibrating like the breath of gods held in tension. Glyphs blazed, runes spun. The warp trembled. Magnus projected himself outward, first through the immaterium, then deeper, into a realm few dared enter. The Emperor was not on Terra's surface. He was beneath it, deep within the crust of the throne world, embroiled in a secret endeavour unknown to almost all. He had withdrawn from the Great Crusade, delegated its leadership to Horus, and turned his focus inward, to something far older and more vital: the Webway. The Emperor was building a hidden pathway through the Immaterium, a vast, stable network of psychic tunnels inherited from the ancient Aldari. This secret Webway project would one day free humanity from the reliance on warp travel, astropathic communication, and the ever-present threat of demonic incursion. It was nothing less than a new golden age, and it required absolute secrecy. Magnus didn't know. As his psychic form descended into Terra's hidden depths, he encountered ward after ward, protections layered by the Emperor himself. Most minds would have recoiled, but Magnus was a Primarch. He pressed onward, unravelling the locks, forcing passage not through violence, but brilliance. Layer by layer, he peeled away the barriers, and then he saw it. The Emperor, seated at the core of the Imperial dungeon, guiding thousands of psychers to sustain a nascent Webway gate. A marvel of psychic engineering unlike anything humanity had ever built. Magnus's psychic message tore through the chamber like a meteor. The Webway gate, fragile and still incomplete, shattered. Demons poured through the breach, screeching, gibbering nightmares that had waited centuries for such an opening. Where once the Emperor had toiled to create a safe path through the warp, now the Immaterium screamed into Terra's heart. Reality itself buckled. Custodians drew blades, psychers exploded, the gate was lost. And Magnus, suddenly aware of what he had done, recoiled in horror. He had succeeded in warning the Emperor, but at what cost? The reply came not in words, but in silence. The psychic link between father and son was severed. On Prospero, the ritual ended in devastation. The psychic feedback ruptured minds and melted circuitry. Magnus stood amidst the ruin of his own making, his soul torn between pride and shame. He defied the Emperor's edict, broken sacred wards, and compromised a project more critical than anything he could have imagined. And yet, he had done it for loyalty. He had done it to save his father. But no messenger came from Terra, no explanation, no summons, no reply. Magnus was left in isolation. The Thousand Sons noticed the change. Their Primarch became distant, his eye often turned inward. He ceased public addresses. The pyramids of Tizca grew quiet. His closest captains, Ahriman, Phocis Takar, Balik Uthazar, sensed the weight upon him, but dared not press. Magnus no longer spoke of enlightenment or the perfectibility of man. He spoke only of silence and the Watcher in the warp. In private, he pondered the Emperor's secrets. Why had such a project been hidden? Why place so much trust in Horus while cutting Magnus off? He had obeyed, argued, and finally warned, and all of it had been thrown back in his face. Perhaps, he thought, the Emperor had never truly trusted him. Perhaps he had always been a weapon, one now discarded. The breaking of the Webway changed more than Terra's defences. It broke Magnus's belief in the unerring rightness of the Imperial truth. His faith in the Emperor's plan had been shaken. He still loved his father, but now, that love was laced with doubt. What followed was waiting. Magnus withdrew further into the warp, seeking understanding. He searched for clarity, for purpose, for justification. And something in the Immaterium answered. Not as voice, but presence. A warmth, a promise, a path. Prospero remained silent above the warp's edge, but beneath its perfect towers and glistening libraries, a fracture had opened. One not of earth or stone, but of soul. And though Magnus did not know it yet, the response to his transgression was already in motion. A blade had been unsheathed, a hunter had been unleashed, and the wolves were on the path to Prospero. The sky above Prospero darkened long before the ships arrived. There were no warnings from Terra, no demands, no summons, no trials. Only silence. And then, suddenly, a storm of fire falling from the stars. The Imperial war machine descended in full. Battle barges, drop pods, squadrons of Thunderhawks screaming through the thin Prosperine air. And at their head, like a blade thrown across the galaxy, came the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves. Fenrisian warriors clad in grey and iron, snarling with purpose. Their objective was not to negotiate, it was not to arrest, it was to punish. The Emperor's will, so Magnus had once believed, was reason, knowledge, balance. But this was something else entirely. This was retribution. The Thousand Sons had no idea it was coming. On the surface, life in Tisga remained unchanged. Scholars debated beneath sunlit domes. Astartes practiced warp discipline forms on golden courtyards. Librarians copied tomes and communed with distant echoes. But in orbit, the wolves had begun their descent. The order had come not from the Emperor, but from Horus. It was a deception so vast, even Magnus did not foresee it. Following the breach of the Webway, the Emperor had remained distant. Horus, as War Master, claimed the right to act in his name. He framed Magnus's warning as treachery, painted the breaking of the Webway as sabotage. He whispered to Leman Russ that Magnus was lost to corruption. And Russ, eager to settle a rivalry that had long smouldered beneath their differences, accepted the charge. He was not coming to arrest Magnus. He was coming to kill him. The first strikes were orbital bombardments. Libraries gone, spires flattened, the seas boiled where plasma met water. Teleport strikes followed, disorienting the defenders, who had no warning, no time to prepare. The Thousand Sons scrambled to respond, caught between confusion and the growing realisation that they were being exterminated. Magnus gave no order to attack. He watched in silence as his city was torn apart. For all his power, for all his foresight, he did nothing. Some say he believed it was justice, that he had broken the Emperor's edict and now bore the punishment. Others believe he had already begun to turn away from the Imperium and was waiting to see where fate would lead. But his sons did not wait. Ahriman and the commanders rallied what forces they could. Defensive formations were drawn hastily. Psychic barriers shimmered to life around shattered walkways. Sorcerers wove kinetic shields, sent fire roaring through the sky. For the first time, the Thousand Sons unleashed their full might, not as scholars, but as warriors. And they were devastating. Waves of space wolves were incinerated, shattered by psychic storms or hurled from the sky mid-descent. Entire squads were consumed by arcane fire, their minds shredded before their bodies hit the ground. The wolves had trained for sorcery, yes, but not like this. The Thousand Sons were not dabblers. They were masters. But for every wolf that fell, another came howling. Leman Russ had brought his elite, veterans of the rout, death-sworn, rune priests who wielded Fenrisian war rituals crafted to kill psykers. Where Thousand Sons summoned flame, the wolves answered with iron. Where Prosperian warriors fought with precision, the wolves fought with fury. Street by street, tower by tower, Tisga was reduced to ruin. And still, Magnus did not act. Not until the city was almost gone. Only then he descended from the Great Pyramid. The sight of him stunned both sides. Wreathed in warp fire, Magnus hovered above the battlefield like an avenging god, his eye burning, his voice carried on psychic winds. Around him, time slowed. Matter rippled. His sorrow was palpable. He spoke not to his sons, but to Russ. It was not a greeting. It was grief. Then the two giants met, in flesh and fury. Russ lunged, a predator with claws drawn. Magnus countered with mind and motion, hurling warp-laced bolts that tore through stone. Their duel shook the city. Each blow from Russ cracked the earth. Each gesture from Magnus bent it. Fire clashed with fang, discipline with rage. But Magnus was holding back. He still believed there might be redemption. Still hoped the Emperor would intervene. He had not come to kill his brother. Russ had no such hesitation. He fought to end the traitor, and with each blow, Magnus began to realise this was not justice. This was execution, and the Emperor was not coming. Then came the moment of breaking. Russ struck low, feinted, and surged. With a mighty roar, he lifted Magnus above his head and broke him across his knee. The sound echoed like thunder through the smouldering ruins of Tisga. Bone cracked, warp light shattered. Magnus screamed, not just in pain, but in betrayal. His body crumpled, his spirit did not. In that instant, as death loomed, the warp answered. Some say Magnus had been watched for decades by something within the Immaterium, a power ancient and patient, and now, in his moment of despair, it offered sanctuary. With his shattered body slipping into ruin, Magnus accepted. He vanished. In a blaze of arcane light, the Crimson King left the material world, his form dissolving into the warp. The space walls were left amid the ruins, victorious but bloodied. Tizca burned, the great library was ash. Statues of gods and scholars lay toppled in the sand. Prospero was dead. The Thousand Suns, broken and scattered, fled into the void. Ahriman led what few survivors he could gather. Their Primarch was gone, their home destroyed, their place in the Imperium erased. What remained was a wound, and a question. Was this truly justice? Or had loyalty been mistaken for rebellion? The burning of Prospero did not end a conflict. It began a transformation. And somewhere, far beyond the veil of reality, Magnus watched, his eye no longer filled with sorrow, but with purpose. Magnus fell through fire and thought. His body, broken by rust, had collapsed into the ruins of Tizca. But Magnus the soul, the mind, the will, the storm, plunged into the sea of the warp. There was no light there, only the swirling currents of raw emotion, memory, and unrealised fate. He drifted, a wounded god among hungry storms. He had tried to save the Imperium. He had warned the Emperor. He had obeyed. And still, they had sent wolves to tear down his home and shatter his legion. Now, he asked the universe a question. Why? The answer came not as words, but as presence. Something vast stirred in the Immaterium, older than time, more patient than death. It had watched Magnus for years. Through his study, through his discipline, through his endless pursuit of understanding. It had whispered to him in dreams he dismissed, in visions he rationalised. Now it spoke clearly. It did not lie. It did not flatter. It offered power and purpose. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the god of magic, mutation and paradox. It had watched the Crimson King stumble along his path, and now it stretched out a talon not in seduction, but in inevitability. Magnus, heart torn and soul adrift, listened. He did not kneel, not yet. But as he drifted through the currents of the warp, he began to understand that his fall had not been an accident. It had been a step. Prospero's destruction was not just a tragedy, it was a transformation. He saw the Imperium as it truly was, fearful, stagnant, and blind. It would never accept the truth of the warp, never embrace its potential. It would always cower behind superstition, behind chains of doctrine and ignorance. The Great Crusade had promised enlightenment, but now that promise was ash. And so Magnus began to walk a different path, a crimson path. From the shadows of the warp, he began to gather the remnants of his legion. The Thousand Suns who had escaped the burning of Prospero were scattered, wounded in body and spirit. Ahriman, ever loyal, held them together. He led them into the warp, guided by signs only a sorcerer could read. It was Ahriman who found the beacon. A ripple of energy unlike any other, pulsing from a point deep within the Immaterium. He followed it, uncertain of its source. And at the centre of that storm, Magnus awaited them. Reborn, radiant, no longer flesh and blood alone. He had changed, not just healed, ascended. The being who greeted the Thousand Suns was taller than before, more radiant, more terrible. Wings of light curled behind his back. His voice echoed through reality like thunder across glass. He was Magnus still, but Magnus crowned in arcane fire, shaped by something far greater than mortal strength. The Thousand Suns knelt, not in worship, but awe. Magnus offered no vengeance, no commands. Instead, he showed them a vision, a sanctuary, a world hidden deep within the warp, unmoored from time and untouched by the Imperium's reach. A place of crystalline towers and shifting skies. A place of crystalline towers and shifting skies. A place where knowledge could flourish, where the warp could be wielded without shame. The planet of sorcerers. It rose not from rock, but from thought, willed into being by Magnus's reshaped mind and guided by Tzeentch's invisible hand. Here, the Thousand Suns would rebuild, not as imperial warriors, but as sorcerer kings. Not as servants of dogma, but as seekers of truth, however twisted that truth became. But there was a price. The flesh change, long suppressed, had returned. The genetic curse that had once nearly destroyed the Legion began to manifest again. Unchecked by the Emperor's safeguards, empowered by the proximity to the warp, the mutation spread faster than ever before. Warriors once proud now degenerated into beasts, twisted reflections of the demons they studied. Magnus, for all his power, could not stop it. And so Ahriman proposed a solution. A great spell. A final rite that would lock the flesh of every thousand sun in stasis, freezing their bodies in perfect form, sealed against mutation. It would draw on forbidden warp lore, massive energy, and dangerous precision, but it could save them. Magnus forbade it. He warned that such a spell would be too great a risk, that it could cost them their souls, that it might do something worse than mutation. But Ahriman was no longer just a student. He was a sorcerer in his own right. He performed the ritual in secret, gathering a cabal of powerful psykers and unleashing the spell at the heart of the planet of sorcerers. And it worked. The flesh change stopped. But the price was worse than anyone could have imagined. The Thousand Sons did not die. They were petrified. Their bodies became dust held together by enchanted armour. Their minds intact, but trapped within hollow shells. No breath, no heartbeat, no pain, no sensation. Only thought and will. Magnus was enraged. Ahriman was exiled. And the Legion, what remained of it, was divided. Those who remained loyal to Magnus stayed in the planet of sorcerers. Others drifted into the warp, becoming mercenaries, demagogues and warlords. The unity of the Legion, already fractured by exile and trauma, now splintered along lines of philosophy and loss. Magnus withdrew to his great spire, silent. He had gained power beyond comprehension, but he had lost everything else. His world, his Legion, his brotherhood, all sacrificed to the promise of a higher path. He had taken the Crimson Road, one paved not with victory, but with questions. And somewhere, behind his single blazing eye, the laughter of Tzeentch echoed, not as mockery, but as prophecy fulfilled. The warp bled. Above the throne world of mankind, the skies tore open with fire and madness. Demons howled through the void, warping realities they poured from the Great Eye. Terra, the seat of the Imperium, the cradle of humanity, now stood besieged by the very sons who had once sworn to protect it. At the heart of that betrayal flew a crimson shape, terrible and resplendent. Magnus the Red had come home. His wings beat with psychic force, trailing fire across the heavens. His eye, now a blazing well of arcane power, pierced the haze of battle with unyielding focus. Around him surged 1,000 suns, or what remained of them, dust-bound Rubric, demon-bound sorcerers, and warp-touch warlords. Their armour shimmered with enchantments, their minds honed like blades. They had not come to burn the throne, they had come to end the lie. The siege of Terra had raged for months. Horus's forces, traitor legions, demonic hosts, corrupted war machines, had breached the outer defences. Titans clashed in the valleys, orbital defences crumbled, and within the Imperial Palace the defenders bled for every inch. But amidst the chaos, each Primarch had a purpose. For Perturobo, it was siegecraft. For Angron, slaughter. For Mortarion, contagion. For Magnus, it was confrontation. He was not here for conquest, he was here for the Emperor. Magnus believed, even now, that he could still make his father understand. Beneath the bitterness, beneath the corruption and the pact he had accepted, a core of a wounded loyalty still burned. The warp had twisted him, but it had not erased that yearning, for recognition, for reconciliation. He descended toward the psychic noosphere that shielded the Sanctum Imperialis. The warp storms parted around him. Demons fled from his presence. Reality itself seemed to pause as Magnus landed upon the scorched flagstones before the Eternity Gate. But he was not alone. A shape emerged from the shadowed corridors of the palace. A cloaked figure, gaunt and tall, his scythe trailing green rot in its wake. Mortarion. Where Magnus burned like a sun, Mortarion oozed like poison. His armour was corroded iron, his aura a storm of decay. He said nothing. Words between brothers were long past. Their ideologies, once merely opposed, had become toxic to one another. Magnus had sought transcendence through knowledge. Mortarion had embraced oblivion through endurance. They clashed in silence. Magnus struck first, a spear of psychic force landing across the causeway. Mortarion deflected it with a twist of his wrist, summoning a cloud of necrotic smog that stripped away the stone beneath them. Wings unfurled, they rose above the battlefield like angels of a forgotten gospel, one of sorrow and fury. Their duel was less physical than conceptual. Magnus unravelled time, folding moments into seconds. Mortarion drowned them in entropy, nullifying spells with caustic nihilism. Warp and anti-warp collided in waves of screaming unreality. Around them, lesser warriors died without understanding what they witnessed, crushed by the echo of the confrontation. But Magnus was not there to win. He had another purpose. Using the duel as cover, he phased into the web of Terra's psychic defences, threading his essence into the immaterium and bypassing walls of steel and flame. His body flickered like a ghost. With a final burst of force, he drove Mortarion back, tore open a rift in the air, and vanished. He was inside. The sanctums of the Imperial Palace, layered in psychic wards and golden defences, should have repelled any incursion. But Magnus had built parts of it. His essence was woven into the gene code of the legions, and for a moment, just one moment, that familiarity gave him passage. He walked halls of silence and memory, statues of heroes long dead, gilded frescoes of a perfect future that had never come. At the end of it all, the throne, a monumental construct of machinery, sorcery, and sacrifice. It loomed in the distance, a citadel of suffering and necessity, and seated upon it, still, radiant, terrible, was the Emperor. Even through the throne's mechanisms, his presence seared like sunlight. Magnus did not kneel. He did not rage. He wept. There, before the father he had betrayed, Magnus let fall his illusions. His demonic grandeur receded. His voice was quiet. He spoke not of vengeance, but of grief. He asked the question that had burned in his soul since the burning of Prospero. Why? Why had the Emperor chosen silence? Why had he turned from Magnus's warning? Why had he allowed the wolves to destroy everything? The Emperor's answer is not recorded. Perhaps he offered no justification. Perhaps he merely listened. But what passed between father and son in that moment was not reconciliation. It was farewell. Magnus stepped forward, not to embrace, but to strike. He summoned a lance of power, forged not of hate, but of resolution. The throne's defences roared, the custodians surged forward, the golden throne flared with apocalyptic force. Magnus's blow never landed. It is said the Emperor rose, only briefly, but enough. Their eyes met, and in that meeting, Magnus saw not a god, but a man bound to a machine, sacrificing himself endlessly for a dream that now lay in ruin. He hesitated, and the moment passed. Magnus was cast out, not destroyed, but ejected like a soul spat from paradise. He screamed as the warp reasserted its claim, ripping him from the palace. His body reformed miles away, bruised, shaken, but not broken. He had reached the Emperor. He had failed, again. The siege raged on, but Magnus took no further part. He vanished into the immaterium, his heart torn by a truth deeper than any spell, that the father he once adored had become a god not by choice, but by necessity, and that Magnus's path, so carefully, painfully chosen, had brought him only despair. He had come seeking answers. He had found only silence. And the Crimson King retreated, wounded, eternal, alone. Time means nothing within the warp. On the planet of sorcerers, centuries passed like heartbeats, and heartbeats stretched into eternities. The mortal galaxy moved on. Legions were broken, chapters born, empires rose and fell. But in the Eye of Terror, the Crimson King watched in silence. His legion was immortal, and yet it was dead. The Rubric stood motionless across the dunes of glass and crystal, armour gleaming beneath the shifting suns of an impossible sky. They were perfect warriors, unbreakable, unyielding, and utterly mute. The sorcerers who commanded them lingered in vast pyramids, whispering formula, playing at godhood with fragments of forbidden knowledge. And above them all, Magnus the Red brooded in his obsidian tower, a titan of regret. The flesh change was gone. The Rubric had done its work. But in ending one curse, Ahriman had forged another. The thousand suns were now prisoners of their own salvation. Every battle fought, every world conquered in Tzeentch's name, only deepened the legion's enslavement to destiny. They were no longer seekers of knowledge. They were instruments of it. Each one a page in a vast, ever-rewriting book authored by the Changer of Ways. Magnus had once dreamed of humanity's ascension. Now, He presided over its damnation. Yet he was not idle. For all his sorrow, Magnus was still a Primarch, still a weapon even in despair. And when the War Master's armies were driven into the Eye of Terror after the heresy, Magnus took his place among them. The Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the Emperor's Children, the World Eaters, all retreated into madness. But the Thousand Sons retreated into purpose. They would fight a different kind of war. The Long War was not one of attrition or conquest. It was a war of meaning, of philosophy, of vengeance. For Magnus, it was never about destroying the Imperium outright. It was about proving it wrong. Every spell cast, every will corrupted, every truth whispered into a mortal ear was a step towards showing mankind that knowledge could not be chained forever. In this, Magnus became the great manipulator's perfect servant. Tzeentch did not command him with chains or threats. He offered visions, glimpses of alternate futures, shards of forgotten truths, promises of redemption always just beyond reach. Magnus saw them, understood the deceit, and still could not look away. Because beneath the god's mockery was the faintest echo of what Magnus once sought: understanding. For millennia, the Thousand Sons spread across the stars. They became the warp's archivists and its executioners. Some formed covens within the Eye, hidden cults that wove the fabric of prophecy itself. Others ventured into real space, leading cabals and demon hosts in raids that spanned centuries. Their enemies were countless: the Imperium, the Grey Knights, the Inquisition, even other traitor legions. Each time they emerged, it was with purpose. Each time, they sought relics, artifacts, and fragments of truth. The dust of the Rubric marched at their command, silent as tombs. To the Imperium, they were nightmares, ghostly armies of flame and ruin that vanished as suddenly as they appeared. And always, above them, the crimson shadow of Magnus watched. From his throne atop the Tower of the Cyclops, Magnus saw every battle his sons fought, every ritual they performed, every failure and fleeting victory. His mind stretched across realities, perceiving time not as a river, but a sea. He saw the threads of destiny, some brilliant, some broken, and began to pluck at them. The Long War was eternal, but Magnus sought more than vengeance. He sought comprehension of the thing that had ruined him, fate itself. He delved into the deeper laws of the warp, beyond the petty bargains of demons and the babbling schemes of mortal sorcerers. He wanted to know why the universe punished those who sought knowledge, why the Emperor had bound himself to the throne, why even gods seemed prisoners of their own compulsions. For every question he answered, 3 more rose in its place. In those millennia of study and war, Magnus's power grew beyond reckoning. He became less a being and more an idea, a vast consciousness that could project itself across systems. His image appeared in the dreams of psychers, in the flame of rituals, in the reflections of polished armour. Some worshipped him as a god in his own right. Others feared him as the hand of Tzeentch, the crimson manifestation of change itself. But power never cured the wound. The memory of Prospero haunted him still. The faces of his sons, their laughter, their humanity, all locked away forever in the silence of their armour. Sometimes, when the warp was calm and the planet of sorcerers quiet, Magnus walked among the Rubric, whispering their names. They never answered. And yet, in his heart, a fragment of the old Magnus remained. He still dreamed. Not of redemption, he was long past that, but of reason. If he could not undo the Rubric, perhaps he could perfect it. If he could not restore his sons, perhaps he could create new ones unbound by the Emperor's chains or Tzeentch's whims. So the Thousand Sons continued their pursuit of knowledge, no longer bound by the Imperium's laws or the fear of damnation. They raided the Black Library of the Aldari, the vaults of the Necrons, and forges of Mars. They collected knowledge as others collected lives. And through it all, the Imperium called them heretics. To the Crimson King, that word had lost meaning long ago. He had become both villain and victim, a being of pure intellect trapped in an endless cycle of cause and consequence. His every act rippled through the galaxy, changing futures and rewriting fates. He had transcended the mortal understanding of sin and virtue. Only the Emperor still haunted him, the one constant Magnus could not unravel. Sometimes he glimpsed terror through the warp's veil, a golden light flickering in an ocean of darkness. He would reach out with his mind, and for a heartbeat, he could almost feel his father's presence. But there was never a reply. Magnus the Red, the scholar, the saviour, the heretic, was alone. And yet, As he gazed into the endless possibilities of the warp, he smiled. Because the long war was not over. It would never be over. Not while there were questions left unanswered. Not while the Imperium still clung to ignorance. Not while the Changer of Ways whispered that someday the balance would shift, and that the Crimson King's hand would be the one to turn the final page. For 10,000 years, Magnus the Red had watched the galaxy burn from the shadows of the warp. Empires rose and fell. The Emperor's Imperium, fractured yet unbroken, endured in its hypocrisy. His father's dream had curdled into dogma, his brothers had become monsters, and the Thousand Suns had faded into whispered legend. Time meant nothing where he ruled, but memory, it endured. And Magnus remembered Prospero. He remembered the fire, he remembered the wolves. That memory, buried beneath layers of millennia of mutation, flared once more when the warp shifted. When the tides of chaos began to churn anew. The Great Rift had not yet torn open, but its first tremors rippled through the Immaterium, stirring the ancient powers from their silence. To Tzeentch, it was an opportunity. To Magnus, it was purpose. His long exile was ending. The Changer of Ways came to him in visions, a kaleidoscope of futures, each a different truth. Magnus saw himself triumphant, a god among men. He saw himself slain, his empire collapsing. He saw the Emperor's light flickering on the throne, dying slowly. And with each vision, one name echoed through the void. Fenris. The homeworld of the wolves. The fortress of his brother's sons. The place where justice, or vengeance, would be reborn. Magnus rose from his obsidian throne. His single eye burned brighter than ever, casting streaks of psychic flame across the crystalline floor. He summoned his sons, those who remained flesh and those who were dust. Across the planet of sorcerers, the air shimmered with sudden energy. Towers trembled, demons howled in jubilation, and the warp itself seemed to bend in anticipation. The Crimson King was returning to real space. With a single gesture, he tore the veil open. Reality screamed as the planet of sorcerers moved, not through space, but through thought. Where once it had floated adrift within the Eye of Terror, it now began to slide toward the Materium, phasing between dimensions in a storm of impossible geometry. The energy it unleashed cracked planets and sent astropaths across the galaxy into fits of terror. And then, Magnus emerged. A crimson figure descending from the void, his wings spanning the stars, his laughter echoing across the psychic space. To some, he appeared as a god of deliverance. To others, a nightmare. To all, a storm made flesh. He came for Fenris. The Space Wolves, long guardians of the Imperium's wild frontier, had grown complacent. Their numbers were diminished, their faith tested by the warp-born storms now raging across the Segmentum Obscurus. When Magnus's forces erupted from the Immaterium, the wolves met them with fury, but not understanding. For Magnus did not attack as a barbarian, he struck as a scholar of destruction. The Thousand Suns fell upon Fenris and its surrounding worlds with surgical precision. Warp portals blossomed like flowers of fire, spilling Rubric and demons into the void. Sorcerers bent reality, reshaping entire battlefields. Bolts of warp lighting obliterated strike cruisers mid-orbit. The very skies bled crimson as Tzeentch's influence engulfed the system. The wolves howled, and the Crimson King answered. The assault was not for conquest, it was for remembrance. Each fortress reduced to ash, each wolf slain beneath psychic flame was a memory avenged. The Sons of Rus had burned Tizca once. Now, Magnus burned Fenris in return. Yet for all his wrath, there was method in it. Within the ruins of the Fang, the Space Wolves' mighty fortress monastery, Magnus sought something deeper. Beneath the layers of ceramite and ice, he found what he was looking for, a vault of knowledge. The wolves had preserved fragments of Prospero's history, relics and records taken during the burning. Among them, Magnus found a shard of his past, artifacts that had once belonged to his legion, memories frozen in enemy hands. He did not destroy them, he took them. Every spell, every ritual, every ancient text was reclaimed. The burning of Fenris was not only vengeance, it was reclamation. The Thousand Suns left the world shattered, its seas boiling, its moon cracked. The walls had survived, but barely. Their world would never be the same. But Magnus's war did not end there. He had proven that it could breach the Materium. He had proven that his power, long denied, long suppressed, was greater than ever. For the first time since the heresy, a demon Primarch walked among the mortals. The galaxy trembled, and the Imperium took notice. Imperial forces rallied, Grey Knights and Inquisitors were dispatched to contain the threat. They arrived too late, Magnus was gone. his world slipping once more between realities. But the scars remained, Fenris burned in the annals of Imperial record as a wound inflicted not by alien or heretic legion, but by a Primarch returned. And somewhere deep within the Immaterium, Magnus smiled. He had tasted real space again. He had measured its limits. And in that act, he had confirmed what he had long suspected. The veil between worlds was weakening. The Emperor's light was fading. Humanity's age of ignorance was collapsing. Change was coming. For the Thousand Suns, the wrath of Magnus marked more than a victory. It was a declaration. The Long War was no longer fought from the shadows. Their time in exile was ending. The warp was stirring. The Great Rift was forming. Magnus began to see visions more vividly than ever before, fractured glimpses of a galaxy torn in half, of Imperium storms engulfing entire sectors, of his father's empire finally breaking under its own weight. Tzeentch's laughter echoed across his mind like thunder. But Magnus no longer served the god out of faith or fear. He used the Changer of Ways as the Changer used him, a mutual manipulation, a dance of deception between master and apprentice. He had learned too much to be a pawn. He would play this new age by his own design. He would reclaim his name. He would reshape his legion. He would bring illumination through destruction. As the planet of sorcerers drifted once more into the shifting tides of the warp, the stars around it began to twist. The Imperium trembled, sensing a new storm rising, a storm crowned in crimson fire and golden flame. And at its heart stood Magnus the Red, wings unfurled, one eye blazing with power, the other sealed forever by sacrifice. A god in all but name, a son in all but forgiveness, and the galaxy would soon learn. The Crimson King had returned. There are names in the galaxy that command both awe and hatred, names whispered with equal parts reverence and fear. Magnus the Red is one of them. 10,000 years have passed since Prospero burned, and still, his story is debated across the Imperium. To some, he is the greatest heretic ever born, the arrogant sorcerer who broke the Emperor's law and opened the door to the demonic. To others, he is the tragic son, the only one who truly understood the warp, punished not for betrayal, but for being right too soon. So the question remains, did Magnus do the right thing? To answer it, one must return to the beginning. Magnus was born not of chance, but of design. Created by the Emperor as a vessel of knowledge and psychic might, he was the pinnacle of human evolution. Yet from his first breath, he was shaped by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Flung through the warp by treachery, raised on a world steeped in sorcery, moulded by curiosity rather than faith. He sought knowledge as others sought conquest. He wanted to understand the truth behind existence itself. And that, perhaps, was his first sin. When the Emperor found him, he saw in Magnus both potential and peril. Together, they forged a vision of enlightenment, a mankind unafraid of its psychic gift. But where the Emperor drew boundaries, Magnus saw cages. Where the Emperor demanded obedience, Magnus offered reason. He did not worship his father as a god, he loved him as a teacher. And that love was what destroyed him. When Horus fell, Magnus foresaw the catastrophe. He tried to warn the Emperor. He broke the Edict of Nicaea not out of malice, but desperation. He believed his father would understand. But in reaching through the warp to deliver that message, he broke the Emperor's most secret work, the nascent Webway, humanity's fragile escape from the warp's corruption. Demons poured into the heart of terror, and the Emperor's wrath was absolute. From that moment on, Magnus's tragedy was sealed. He had meant to save his father. He had damned him instead. The burning of Prospero followed, not as justice, but as vengeance. The wolves were unleashed, not to arrest, but to annihilate. Magnus's world died in fire, and his faith in the Emperor died with it. Yet even as his body broke beneath Russ's blade, he did not curse his father. He cursed himself. Perhaps that is what makes his story endure. He was never truly a monster. When he accepted Tzeentch's offer, it was not for glory or power. It was because he had nowhere else to turn. His world was gone, his legion dying, his destiny shattered. The warp became his refuge, and Tzeentch his mirror. The Changer of Ways offered what the Emperor had denied, understanding. But every answer came with a price, and soon Magnus's search for knowledge became a labyrinth of manipulation. He had become what he once feared, a pawn of fate. And yet, even in damnation, his brilliance endured. He shaped worlds from thought. He challenged gods in their own realm. He rebuilt his legion from ash and turned the Eye of Terror into a fortress of forbidden wisdom. He did not rot like other traitor Primarchs. He evolved. His tragedy was not decay, but awareness. He saw the pattern. The the great lie that bound mortals and immortals alike, that every act of rebellion feeds the very power it seeks to overthrow. Magnus knew that, and still he rebelled. When he returned to real space during the Wrath of Magnus, it was not mere vengeance that guided him, it was clarity. The Imperium had become everything his father once opposed, a theocracy of ignorance, worshipping the husk of a man chained to a machine. Magnus no longer sought forgiveness, he sought proof that the Emperor's design had failed, and that enlightenment through the warp, no matter how corrupted, was inevitable. He burned Fenris not only to settle old debts, but to show the galaxy that the sons of the Imperium's so-called heretics still had purpose. In his fury, there was conviction. In his destruction, there was philosophy. But was it right? That depends on which truth one chooses to believe. If one measures rightness by loyalty to the Emperor, then Magnus was a traitor. He defied his law, shattered his work, and allied with powers he swore to destroy. Billions have suffered because of what he unleashed. But if one measures it by intent, by the purity of the thought that drove him, then Magnus stands apart from the other Primarchs. He did not fall to greed like Fulgrim, or rage like Angron, or pride like Horus. He fell for knowledge. He fell for belief. He fell for trying to save a father who could no longer be saved. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, that Magnus's tragedy is not in his corruption, but in his conviction. Even now, within his crystal citadel upon the planet of sorcerers, the Crimson King broods over his tomes and scrolls. He sees every branching timeline, every possible future. In some, the Emperor rises again. In others, the warp consumes all. He has seen 1,000 versions of humanity's end, and in none of them is he the hero. And still he searches. Because for all his mistakes, Magnus the Red has never stopped believing that understanding is worth the cost, even if the cost is everything. Was he right? The Imperium calls him damned. The Inquisition marks his name with excommunication and terror. His brothers see him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of pride unbound. And yet, among the scholars, the heretics, and the dreamers scattered across the stars, there are whispers, quiet, dangerous whispers, that maybe, just maybe, Magnus did nothing wrong. And so the question remains unanswered, echoing across 10,000 years of war. Was Magnus the Red a monster? Or was he the only one who ever truly saw the truth? You have received the transmission of Dominissimo Voxlore. The tale of Magnus the Red closes not in victory, but in revelation. A being damned by pride, yet driven by purpose. A son who sought to save his father, and instead changed the fate of humanity forever. If you have walked this crimson path with me, mark your allegiance. Strike the seal of subscription. Join the Dominissimo Vox network and lend your voice to the truth of the Imperium's past. Every broadcast strengthens the signal. Every subscriber carries forward the law. Until the next transmission, guard your thoughts, question all truths, and remember, in the darkness of the 41st millennium, knowledge is both weapon and curse.